Welcome to Podcast and Business. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. Alex Edmans is a professor of finance at London Business School. He's the author of the book Grow the Pie: How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, featured in the Financial Times Best Business Books of 2020. In this episode, I talked to Professor Edmans about interesting concepts from his book. Also, we highlight some exciting points from his paper, The End of ESG. Hello, Alex. How are you? It's a pleasure to have you today as a guest.
I'm doing great, thanks, Juan Carlos. It's a pleasure for me to be here also.
Alex, let's split this conversation in two parts. The first is about your book, Grow the Pie: How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profits. And the second part is about an excellent paper you recently published entitled The End of ESG. So I would like to start this conversation by asking you, in your book, Grow the Pie, you talk about the pie grow mentality. Would you mind explaining what this concept is?
Certainly. I think a good place to start is to explain what is the pie. So the pie is the amount of value that a company creates, and that value can be shared between investors in the form of profits and stakeholders in the form of fair taxes, fair wages, and fair prices. And we often think that the pie is fixed. Many people have the pie splitting mentality. And if you think the pie is fixed, then the only way to increase profits is to take slices from others. For example, you could pay workers as little as possible, or you could charge customers as high prices as possible. But what the pie growing mentality is the idea that the pie is not fixed, the pie can be grown. So if you treat your workers well, for example, pay them better than you need to, invest in their human capital development, then these workers will become more productive, more motivated, and more likely to stay. And that might sound like wishful thinking, but in fact is not. And indeed, the heartbeat of the book is rigorous evidence to show that indeed many things that companies do to invest in their stakeholders, they do ultimately lead to long-term profits down the line. And so why I think this is really important is many people think about ESG as being moral and ethical. Some indeed dismiss it as being woke. But I'm highlighting that ESG has a financial and business and commercial case. So I come to this topic as a professor of finance, as an ex-investment banker, and why I can be so passionate about ESG is it has the financial and commercial case, not just the moral and ethical case.
Thank you, Alex, for your answer. Something that I learned from your book is how important it is to create value for society. Alex, another fascinating term from your book is pie economics. What is pie economics? Can you elaborate a little bit about this, please?
Yes, indeed. So pie economics, some people call it pie economics. So this is the idea that the pie can be grown. So it's the idea of running a business with the pie growing mentality in mind. So how we want to increase profits, not to view profits as something that we pursue directly as a result of squeezing everybody else, but instead first think about how can we grow the pie, how can we create shared value, and view profits as being a byproduct of serving wider society. So this is similar to maybe how a person lives their life. So what is the meaning of life? People might say it's happiness, but you don't pursue happiness directly, because if you do that, you might just eat a lot and drink a lot and be selfish. But instead, if you pursue happiness indirectly, let me try to help others, let me try to be a good friend, a good employee, a good boss, a good parent, and so on, then happiness will come as a byproduct rather than something that's pursued directly. And that's what pie economics is about, is viewing profits as an outcome, not as the primary objective. Now, in order to pursue pie economics, it's really important to have a long-term mindset, because while the pie can be grown, the pie can only be grown in the long term. In the short term, the pie is fixed. If you pay your workers more, then this does eat into short-term profits. Now, it's true that in the long term, the workers will be more productive and more motivated, but this will only be something in the long term. So, critical to practicing economics is changing the horizons with which we evaluate companies, because if a company has a short term mindset, then even if they do believe in economics, they can't put it into practice because they're having to deal with short term pressures and short term targets.
Alex, speaking about long term and short term, in your latest document published in the Social Science Research Network entitled The End of ESG, you mention, quoting, the biggest driver of this ascent is the recognition that ESG factors are critical to a company's long term value. My question is, are companies and organizations aware that everything related to these metrics or factors must be long term?
I do believe they are aware, Juan Carlos. I'd actually say the problem is that they are too aware. So there's many companies who think that ESG is always long term, and anything which is not ESG is always short term. So this is why I called my recent paper The End of ESG. So you might think, well, that's a strange title for an ESG advocate like me to write. But why I highlighted this and why I called it that was to try to discourage people from thinking about ESG as a black or white term, where everything which is ESG must be long term and everything which is not must be short term. For example, there are some non ESG factors that do create long term value. For example, innovative capability, productivity, those things are good for the long term effectiveness of a company and the value it creates for society, but they don't fall under an ESG bucket. So any company that improves its innovation or improves its productivity, they might not win as many plaudits as if they were to cut their carbon emissions or water usage. And on the flip side, there might be certain ESG metrics where they don't actually create long-term value, and it might be that companies pursue those ESG metrics to do some short-term box ticking. For example, let's take diversity. That's something I care about as an ethnic minority. But there are some companies which take short-term actions to hit particular diversity targets. For example, it could be that a company hires lots of ethnic minorities to tick a box, but that does nothing for the inclusiveness of the corporate culture. It's not just about bringing certain people in, but ensuring that they feel psychologically safe, that they're able to contribute their own viewpoints, that they're able to speak up. And in contrast, there might be other people who provide cognitive diversity, such as white males from a different socioeconomic background. And if you hired them, that would be good for the long-term cognitive diversity of the company, but it will not hit short-term diversity metrics. So I think just the last categorization you gave, Juan Carlos, is the correct one. To think about factors as being short-term and long-term, not to think about them as being ESG or non-ESG, and in particular, not to put ESG factors on a pedestal compared to non-ESG factors, because actually many of these ESG factors might be less relevant for long-term value than some non-ESG ones.
Interesting, Alex. Alex, speaking about ESG and organizations, and continuing with one of the points in your paper, The End of ESG, you emphasize the issue of ESG metrics. Why have these metrics become so challenging for companies and organizations today? And if you allow me, I would like to add the ratings also became so challenging as well. What is your opinion?
I think there's several reasons, and one I will pick up on the point of ratings that you just raised, is that these ESG metrics or ratings will disagree with each other. So there's a fantastic paper just recently published in the Review of Finance, which is the academic journal that I'm editor of. It's called Aggregate Confusion, the Divergence of ESG Ratings, which shows that ESG ratings disagree with each other quite significantly. So while credit ratings will have a correlation of about 99%, for these ESG ratings, it might be anywhere from like 0.3 to 0.7. And what is the source of that disagreement? Well, first, we don't even know what counts as ESG to begin with. everybody will agree that carbon emissions are part of ESG, but is electromagnetic radiation, is that part of it? Well, some would say yes, others would say no. And then second, even if we agree that something should be counted, we might not know how to measure it. So is the female friendliness of a company measured by the percentage of women in the senior management team, the percentage of women in the wider workforce, the gender pay gap, maternity leave policy? It's really not clear. So I think one reason why it's challenging is that there is disagreement. But the other reason is the flip side, is that people do not recognize that disagreement is inevitable. So there's some companies and some investors who think we should have one unambiguous rating, a bit like earnings, where everybody agrees what the earnings of a company is. Why can't they agree about the ESG rating? But that's because there's many aspects of ESG which are subjective. So you and I might have different views as to what counts as ethical. For example, maybe I put more weight on employee diversity, you might put more weight on climate change. And this is fair. And we might look at different things. And so I think people who look at ratings and metrics and say, oh, well, they disagree with each other. This means that the data is confusing. I have no idea how to evaluate a company because the metrics are different. Well, another way of thinking about disagreement is the term diversity, which we mentioned earlier. It's actually good to have a diversity of opinion. And indeed, virtually everything about a company which is important, there will be a difference of opinion. Right? Is the strategy of a company good or bad? Would we ever think, let's have a strategy rating that everybody agrees on? That would never be the case, because reasonable people could have a disagreement about the strategy. What about management quality? Again, different people will think that management is good versus bad. And so I think one of the reasons why there's so much challenges is that people have not recognized that actually these metrics are only opinion. They are not fact. And once you recognize their opinion, then actually people will be much more willing to embrace the subjectivity rather than be put off by it.
Thank you so much, Alex. I like your saying that it's good to have different opinions about ESG. Alex, what kind of trends do you think we will see this year around ESG? Perhaps companies may focus on better stakeholder engagement, less politicization, just ratings, or more focus on materiality, for example. What do you think?
I think the trends will be like anything that becomes popular. So when something becomes popular, then everybody wants to jump on it and adopt it, and then there becomes a bit of a backlash and a correction. For example, let's take the dot-com bubble, right? So everybody back then was trying to even add .com to their name. They thought, let's do everything online, when actually there's many things that can't be done online. And so there was a correction afterwards. And I think ESG might be in a bubble, or might have just be past the bubble, because now there is a backlash against it. And I think what I hope to see in the future is a much more nuanced, grown-up, two-sided discussion about ESG. So for me, despite being a strong ESG advocate, and that was the point of the book Grow the Pie, I recognise that not everything about ESG is amazing. There are certain ESG factors that don't pay off in the long term. There are certain factors that do pay off in the long term that are not part of ESG, and that's why I wanted to write this End of ESG article. And so I think a lot of the reason why ESG has got a backlash is there's overblown claims about ESG without people being willing to recognise the other side. And I do hope that we can have some more grow up and less political discussions about ESG, because nowadays, anybody who's seen to be an ESG skeptic, people say, well, you must be a Republican who doesn't care at all about climate change, when actually they might just have a different opinion as to what creates long-term value. So there could be some investors who say, in terms of pure financial materiality, we don't need to take carbon emissions into account. Why? There is not a fair carbon tax right at the moment, so companies can get away with polluting and not suffer the consequences. And this is unfortunately what the data shows. Companies that emit more carbon do deliver higher long-term returns. So what that suggests is there is a trade-off. If you're going to decarbonize your portfolio, you might actually suffer a return loss to that. Now, that doesn't mean that you're a climate change denier. You're just stating the fact that actually there is a trade-off here and decarbonising might cost us something in returns. But anybody who says, well, actually, we might not want to decarbonise, right now, they're accused of being climate change deniers. There was actually a professor from Oxford who calls such people Taliban and flat earthers. And I think this is just unprofessional. I think, particularly as an academic who should encourage debate and discourse, I think we should be willing to embrace different viewpoints and not impugn negative motives to this, like having a particular political viewpoint or just being biased against climate science.
Oh, Alex, thank you so much. Great answer. Alex, before wrapping up, is there anything you would like to add? Also, I always wanted to ask you this question. Do you think small and medium-sized businesses can get into ESG?
Absolutely. And this is why I think it's important to have the pie growing mindset. Because if ESG is about splitting the pie differently, then if you split the pie by giving more to society, that's costly in terms of profits. And if you're a small company, you just can't afford to do that. That's not realistic. And indeed, you just can't give money to charity. You can't make these big grand gestures like large companies do that. But the pie growing mentality is not about spending money. It's about creating social value. And this often involves using the expertise that you have in your hand to serve society, even if it doesn't cost you much. So what did we have in the pandemic? Well, in the pandemic, you had many companies who were short of profits because of the economic situation, but they were still able to help out. So you might have an engineering company using its engineering expertise to make ventilators to help in coronavirus. Now, that was using the expertise they already had, so this didn't cost them much. You could have people like gym companies offering, say, free Instagram workouts, which made a huge difference to people self-isolating at home. So the question that I always encourage leaders of small businesses to ask themselves is, what is in my hand? By that I mean, what are the resources and what is the expertise that I have, and how can I use this to serve society? And it needn't be the most grand gesture that involves spending lots of money. Right now, companies get lots of great publicity by saying, I gave £1 million to Black Lives Matter. But rather than chasing publicity and doing grand gestures, what are the small things that we can do using the expertise that I have? And that's something which I think is realistic. So, Juan Carlos, you asked, is there anything that I would like to add? And I think it's a view, responsibility and serving others as realistic, not just for the largest companies. And it's something that we shouldn't just do for social or woke or moral reasons or publicity reasons. I think we should do it because in the long term, if we serve society, that ultimately then benefits us as a business.
Alex, where people can reach you and get your book?
Well, thanks so much for asking, Juan Carlos. So the book is called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. So you can get that from any online bookstore. My website, alexedmans.com, and I've got another called growthepie.net. That's something where I will post my writings. The Grow the Pie one will be particularly my writings on ESG. And I'm also available at Twitter, at Edmans, and on LinkedIn. So I share my work there. But what I really try to do is share other people's work. So there's many Twitter feeds and LinkedIn feeds where people will only post their own articles and so on. But for me, I love learning. And as an academic, I love hearing different viewpoints and learning from others. And so when I find great articles, I will post them. For example, I did not write the aggregate confusion paper on ESG ratings, but I've probably done maybe 5 to 10 posts on LinkedIn and Twitter about this paper because I think it's really, really important. And so hopefully people who follow those feeds will not just get my own personal research, my own personal view, but my responsibility is to try to convey the good scientific research on ESG more generally, regardless of whether it was me who wrote it.
Thank you, Alex, for this information. Alex, I would like to say thank you for your time and thank you for being my guest.
Well, thank you so much, Juan Carlos. It was a great pleasure to be invited. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. Thank you so much, everyone.